This is the Music History In-Depth podcast for May 29th through June 4th. On this oversized edition, we discuss how a classic ballet had a not-so-good reception, how one concert can change the world, and how picking on the establishment can lead to great sales. This show goes more in depth about some of the events that we put on our daily podcast, the Music History Today podcast, which drops every single day, including weekends, wherever you get your podcast from. Now, on to this week's episode. Let's start this week's podcast with a movie, shall we? On November 30th, 1940, Walt Disney released an animated movie that celebrated both animation and great classical music called Fantasia. In the movie were classic musical pieces from the likes of Beethoven, Bach, Schubert, and Tchaikovsky. The fourth piece of music in the movie backed up the animation of the formation of the Earth right up to the extinction of the dinosaurs. 27 years earlier, however, the audience who first heard this music thought the composer was the one who should have been made extinct. On May 29, 1913, the audience who heard the ballet at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées in Paris, France, were expecting to hear something pleasing and audience-friendly, much like this composer's ballet only 3 years earlier. Instead, what they got was a ballet that depicted a virgin sacrifice in pagan Russia, along with a jarring bassoon noise, and that was just the opening. The audience, to be nice about it, hated it. They booed, threw things, and started making dog noises. The noise became so great that you couldn't even hear the orchestra, and the choreographer of the ballet had to shout instructions to his dancers. To say that it didn't go too well is an understatement. However, times change, and after a while the ballet and the music accompanying it became classics. The audience on May 29, 1913 were hoping to hear another version of the composer's ballet from 3 years earlier, known as The Firebirds. Instead, they were treated to a piece that was way ahead of its time for 20th century classical music, Igor Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring. So far ahead of its time that 27 years later, the ballet with a virgin sacrifice in the beginning became part of a Disney kids movie. The ballet, The Rite of Spring from Igor Stravinsky, was first heard on May 29th, 1913. Next, we discuss a composer and his most famous opera. Georges Bizet was born on October 25, 1838 in Paris, France. He started out pretty well, winning awards at the Conservatoire de Paris, and even though he was lauded for his piano skills, he never really played in public. Instead, he wrote operas and other works, most of which missed the mark with the public at the time. Finally, he hit pay dirt with an opera. Well, sort of, but it wasn't immediate. Bizet's opera was first performed in 1875 after the controversy surrounding it almost derailed the performance. The opera was about a gypsy girl who seduces an army corporal named Don Jose, who was engaged at the time. And after being seduced by the girl, Don Jose helps the girl escape trouble with the cops, only to then be put in jail himself for doing it. He then deserts the army in order to be with her, and as with every great love story, the girl kicks Don Jose to the side for a bullfighter. Don Jose, of course, can't handle it. It is an opera, after all. So he kills her by stabbing her. Why great love stories always end with someone dead, I couldn't tell you, but I'm looking at you, Shakespeare and Romeo and Juliet. Spoiler alert, Romeo and Juliet both die. Sorry. Anyway, here is where the controversy kicks in with this particular opera. The Opéra Comique in Paris, France, where the opera was being staged, was known for family-friendly productions. Where have you heard that before? Maybe about 3 minutes ago. Doing one where someone gets killed was not exactly going to go over too well. Members of the production's leadership got into a heated battle over it, and it got to the point where one of them quit because the composer wouldn't change the script. The scandal was so hot that big actresses of the era wouldn't even try out for the part of the main character. It was that toxic a controversy. Finally, on March 3rd, 1875, that opera, Carmen, premiered. At first, it was met with halfway decent reviews. However, as time went on, people began to warm up to the opera and it became a classic. Unfortunately, George Bizet didn't live long enough to see Carmen become huge, having had a heart attack on June 3rd, 1875, and dying only 30 performances into the opera's run. As with a lot of artists, his music was, of course, appreciated after his death. In Bizet's case, it was in the 20th century, and that was after a lot of his manuscripts were either lost or altered. Even the critics who wanted to crush Carmen went and called it a masterpiece after Bizet passed away. Such is human nature sometimes. The man who wrote the opera Carmen, composer George Bizet, passed away on June 3rd, 1875. Now we celebrate the birthday of a legendary bandleader. This man was the 9th out of 12 kids. His father came from Poland and his mother came from Lithuania. They met in Baltimore and moved to Chicago, Illinois, where our bandleader was born. Their neighborhood was in the ghetto in the Maxwell Street neighborhood, and although the family didn't have any money, the father somehow managed to pay for his kids' music lessons as the kid became interested in music. While he was in Chicago, he learned from artists such as Johnny Dodds and Jimmy Noon. By the time he was 14, he was already playing professionally. His father, unfortunately, didn't live to see his success. He passed away tragically in an accident when the kid was 17. After that, the kid moved to New York City and became a successful session musician. After a number of years, he got a band of his own together and started work in the supper clubs and got on a radio show on NBC called Let's Dance. There, the band started playing a new style of music called swing. The radio show was popular enough, but it became the victim of a strike and was canceled right in the middle of the Great Depression. Now here's where history takes a weird turn. The radio show lineup was such that the kids' band was on late in the evening, sometimes after midnight on the East Coast. On that East Coast, that meant that most people hadn't heard this new style of music or of the band itself because it was way too late for everybody. However, on the West Coast, the radio show was live, not taped, which meant that people were listening around 9 o'clock in the evening to the show due to the 3-hour time difference between East Coast and West Coast. And it was there that the band and the swing style of music took hold. The band heard that kids on the West Coast had invented dances to do with their music, so they scraped some money together and went on tour on the West Coast. And little by little, the music and the dancing went from the West Coast to the East Coast and began to catch on. And the rest, of course, is history. The music and dancing became a cultural phenomenon known as swing music, and its Pied Piper, clarinetist and bandleader Benny Goodman became the catalyst, and he was born on May 30th, 1909. Next, we're going to talk about two albums that were released 7 days apart that helped to define the careers of both artists and also of the 1980s in general. We'll discuss the one that was released on May 29th, 1984 first. On the May 21st through 28th edition of the Music History In-Depth podcast, we discussed the life and career of Tina Turner, who passed away on May 24, 2023. We very briefly touched upon her comeback album, but we're going to go more in-depth on the album since it came out this week in 1984. Now, unless you're a diehard Tina Turner fan or you saw her biopic, What's Love Got to Do with It, starring Angela Bassett and Lawrence Fishburne, then you may not know just how close Tina Turner came to being yet another star who used to be somebody, as critics like to say. After the demise of both her marriage and musical partnership with Ike Turner, Tina's career was in really bad shape. Her first attempts at a solo career went nowhere. From 1974 to 1979, Tina put out 4 solo albums, with 1975's album Acid Queen doing any sort of chart action or money, due mainly to her appearance in the movie version of The Who's rock opera Tommy as the Acid Queen. She needed to put food on the table in order to feed her kids, since she barely got any financial help, especially from Ike. Things got so bad that she had to defy United Nations sanctions against the racist apartheid regime of South Africa and play gigs at their showcase resort called Sun City. Sun City was the resort and entertainment complex that South Africa used to try to show the world that they weren't really as bad as the world was making them out to be, even though they were really as bad as the world was making them out to be. Think of Sun City as that era's music washing version of sports washing, with insert whatever country you want to accuse of it here. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc., etc. There's plenty to choose from. Anyway, there was even an all-star protest album called Sun City by a group that was fronted by little Steven Van Zandt called Artists Against Apartheid. The album was called Sun City and featured the likes of Bono, Miles Davis, Bruce Springsteen, among many others. I only bring all this up to show you just how far Tina had fallen off the public radar and also in the eyes of the record labels. Tina received a lot of backlash for going to South Africa and was considered somewhat damaged goods, although she received much more empathy once people finally realized the reason why she went, because she had to put food on the table to feed her kids because Ike wasn't helping out. This backlash, for the record, was not received to the same extent by other artists who also played Sun City at the time, like Queen and Rod Stewart. Enter John Carter. John was an A&R guy at Capitol Records who wanted to sign Tina to a recording contract. Partially because of Sun City, but mainly because Tina's career seemed to be going nowhere at that point after 4 solo albums that did absolutely nothing. A lot of people at Capitol Records did not want to sign Tina. John decided to put his career on the line and sign Tina to a Capitol Records recording contract. This next album that they made was recorded at Farmyard, Mayfair, Wessex, Good Earth, and Abbey Road recording studios in England by 4 different producing teams. There were 14 songs recorded for the albums. 9 made the American release. 10 songs made the international release, with that 10th song being a remake of the Beatles song Help, with the jazz fusion group The Crusaders as her backup band, and was produced by jazz great Joe Sample, along with Ndugu Chancellor and Wilton Felder. John Carter produced the song Private Dancer, which was written by Mark Knopfler of Dire Straits fame. The guitar solo in the song, by the way, was done by Jeff Beck. John also produced the Paul Brady-written song Steel Claw. I Might Have Been Queen was co-written and produced by super producer Rupert Hine, who also produced Better Be Good to Me. Better was co-written by Holly Knight, Nicky Chin, and Mike Chapman, who all wrote huge songs in the 1970s and 1980s. Greg Walsh co-produced 2 cover songs for Tina, David Bowie's 1984 and Al Green's Let's Stay Together. Walsh's co-producer on the songs was Martin Ware, who was the co-founder of 2 80s bands, The Human League and Heaven 17. Terry Britton was the producer on 3 songs, a cover version of Ann Peoples' I Can't Stand the Rain, Show Some Respect, and What's Love Got to Do with It, which he also co-wrote. In 1997, the other 4 songs made it onto a remastered edition of the album, all of them produced by John Carter. I Wrote a Letter, Rock and Roll Widow, Don't Rush the Good Things, and a cover version of the Animal song When I Was Young. In November 1983, Tina released Let's Stay Together in the UK, then her version of Help in the UK in February 1984. The first official American release was What's Love Got to Do with It in May of 1984. However, the music video for Let's Stay Together started getting some airplay on MTV before What's Love Got to Do with It, so American audiences became familiar again with Tina before the music video for What's Love Got to Do with It and the song for it came out. The album Private Dancer was released on May 29, 1984 to critical acclaim and commercial success. What's Love became a smash hit, going to number 1 and becoming one of the biggest singles of the 1980s. Better Be Good to Me and Private Dancer were also released in the United States and became huge hits. She released I Can't Stand the Rain in 1985 in the UK and Show Some Respect in 1985 in the US. After starting out 1984 being the opening act for Lionel Richie on his tour just before Private Dancer came out, Tina shifted gears and went on a 177 concert headlining tour in 1985 with the groups Mr. Mister and Glenn Frey as her opening acts. Tina had a stacked backup band for the tour, including Timmy Capello on keyboards and saxophone, who became almost as big a sex symbol as Tina back then for being muscular and not wearing a shirt on stage, because, that's how it works. There's a concert video of the tour that was actually made. You can find that on YouTube and a couple other spots. She put in an appearance with her good friend Mick Jagger at Live Aid and recorded a hit duet with Bryan Adams called It's Only Love for Bryan's album that came out around that time. She also won 4 out of 6 Grammy Awards that she was nominated for and sold 12 million copies worldwide. Leonard Bernstein even cut his honorary Grammy Award speech short because, as he said, he really just wanted to watch Tina Turner perform, and she was next up on the program. After that came 4 other chart-topping albums, along with record-breaking tours until her retirement in 2009. Tina's comeback was complete. Safe to say that John Carter kept his job at Capitol Records as well. The release of Tina Turner's comeback album Private Dancer on May 29th, 1984. In the music industry, there are 2 people who are nicknamed the Boss. Singer Diana Ross is sometimes called that because of her hit single, The Boss. Really, though, there's only one person who gets to wear the crown of being called the Boss. Of course, he sometimes also gets called something else. Bruce! Bruce Springsteen is an American icon and one of the guys who helped to popularize Heartland rock, along with John Mellencamp and Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. In a musical career, a successful artist can usually point to one album as the album that took them from being a critical darling to becoming a star. Some can go with even more albums that then took them from being a star to being a superstar and then an icon status symbol. For instance, U2 went to superstar status with the Joshua Tree and then went next level with Achtung Baby. Michael Jackson, of course, went from star with Off the Wall to mega superstar and icon with Thriller, literally overnight. Watch or listen to last week's in-depth episode to find out how all that happened. Here's a hint. He did the moonwalk. But have you ever wondered how Bruce Springsteen became Bruce? Well, it all came about in the 1980s, and it had some unintended help from, of all things, politics. The year was 1982. After Bruce had put out the popular album The River, he put out what some would consider to be his best songwriting with the album Nebraska. He definitely thought it was his best songwriting ever at that point. The album, which was more acoustic, did do pretty well on the pop charts, but by this point, Bruce had already made the leap to star status. After years of being a critical darling, he finally broke through with the general public with the album Born to Run. The River kept things flowing, pun intended, while Nebraska ended being that wrong turn that just kept going, at least in the public arena. The critics loved it, though. Bruce started writing songs for his next album by freshening up some songs that he had started writing during Nebraska. This time around, he decided to go more pop, well, at least his version of pop. He incorporated more synthesizers and whatnot, but he didn't lose his overall rock feel except for maybe one song. He also didn't lose what got Bruce to where he was: his lyrics about the plight of the American dream. The album was recorded over the first 4 months of 1982, then finished in June and October of 1983. There were 80 songs that were written during that time period, with some of the songs landing on Nebraska and the vast majority of the songs going into the vault to see the light of day on some anniversary package, I'm sure, at some point. Most of the 12 songs were recorded at the Power Station, while a few others were recorded at the Hit Factory, both recording studios being in New York City. John Landau, who was also Bruce's manager, did co-production duties along with Chuck Plotkin, Bruce, and Stephen Van Zandt. Toby Scott was the engineer on the project. Bill Sheneman engineered No Surrender. Mastering was done by Bob Ludwig. Andrea Klein did the album art design, and famed celebrity photographer Annie Leibovitz did the famous album cover shot. More about that album cover in a minute. Some songs, like No Surrender, Bruce actually considered leaving off the album but was talked into keeping them. The song Dancing in the Dark was about as pop as you could get from Bruce and was the first song released from the album. It was very danceable, which was not the Springsteen way at the time. Legend has it that the album was technically finished during an overnight session in October of 1983, but John Landau didn't think that even after all of that recording, that there was a single on the album, as they like to say. Springsteen got angry, went home, cooled off a little bit, sat down, and wrote Dancing in the Dark. John was wrong, though. Turns out there were actually 7 singles on that album. Anyway, the music video for Dancing in the Dark featured an onstage dance with a young woman who would go on to make a show about 6 friends who could afford million-dollar apartments by doing menial labor jobs, and in a city of 8 million people with over 100 nationalities, only knew 2 black women and no other minorities to speak of. Seriously. In New York City. But I digress. This is not about Courtney Cox, and this is not about the TV show Friends that everybody loves. This is about Bruce. So, circle back to Bruce. Born in the USA was finally released on June 4th, 1984. That's the album, not the single. It was the first album whose CD was made in America, as up to that point, CDs had been made in Japan. Also, CDs didn't get popular until the early 1990s, so Springsteen was way ahead of his time. Due to Dancing in the Dark, the album proved very popular, debuting at number 9 in America and hitting number 1 3 weeks later. While the album started hot, and with Springsteen laying the groundwork for superstardom for almost a decade at that point, Bruce still wasn't at icon level just yet. What happened were a few things. For starters, Bruce went and toured Europe, and it was there that he noticed that he was beginning to sell out huge stadiums in places where his music hadn't been popular before. He also, at that time, had all 7 of his albums to date on the British albums chart at the exact same time, a feat not even the Beatles managed to pull off in their home country at that point. The album had some controversy with it, which is what led to it becoming even bigger in some ways. First was the meaning behind the title track, Born in the USA. The song is actually about the plight of the Vietnam veterans, with the phrase Born in the USA really meaning, why am I being treated in this manner? I was born in the USA. The meaning was completely lost on people, though, who only heard Born in the USA and think that it's actually a patriotic song. It's not. Yet, to this very day, It still gets played at every single 4th of July fireworks show. Go figure. Apparently, it was also lost on President Ronald Reagan, who, during a campaign rally, tried to incorporate Springsteen into one of his speeches, talking about the American values that he shared with Bruce and the song. Trust me, Reagan had no. Just no. Anyway, Bruce was having none of it, smacking down Reagan at his next concert, saying that apparently Reagan hadn't really listened to his albums, especially Nebraska, which talked about the plight of the working man. Reagan, for the record, also won by a landslide that year against Walter Mondale, taking 49 out of 50 states. Another bit of controversy concerned the album cover. The now famous photo of Bruce standing in blue jeans in front of the American flag with his back to the camera was seen by some to make it look like Bruce was urinating on the flag itself. It was unintentional. Besides, Bruce had buffed up between Nebraska and the new album, wanted to show off a little. Can't blame a guy. Being buff is also what helped him to become an icon at that time as well, because people certainly paid more attention to him after that. So, between his European tour and all the political posturing at home over him, Bruce suddenly found himself an international superstar. Born in the USA, ended up giving him 7 top 10 singles, became one of the biggest selling albums of all time, and his high-octane marathon church revival-style concerts established Bruce as the boss. And that is how Bruce became Bruce. Bruce Springsteen's album Born in the USA, released on June 4th, 1984. Before we go any further, we'd like to tell you about our other podcasts. The Music History Today podcast goes over the daily events in music history and drops daily, including weekends, on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. There's also the Music Halls of Fame podcast, which talks about a member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, along with other Music Halls of Fame's museums and walks of fame. The Music Halls of Fame podcast drops every Thursday and can also be found on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Now, back to this podcast. Now, all of that could have made for just one podcast, but there's a lot that happened in this week in music history, so let's keep going. The next 2 stories both happened on June 1st, and both concern the exact same band. First, let's do a little backstory. In 1966, the Beatles decided that they were done touring. They couldn't deal with being on stage anymore. The screaming from their fans had gotten so loud that they couldn't even hear themselves play. As John Lennon said, they could, quote, send out 4 waxworks and that would satisfy the crowds. Beatles concerts have nothing to do with music anymore. They're just bloody tribal rites, end quote. Finally, they had enough. No more touring. Time to take a few months off for a break to work on individual projects. During that time, by the way, John met Yoko Ono. And then concentrate on being in the studio and creating new music. But what and in which direction should they go? The band had already started to take the turn from being a glorified boy band when they put out their 1965 album Rubber Soul and then their 1966 album Revolver. Now, Paul McCartney wanted to take it to a whole other level. Late in 1966, he had an idea about doing a song about a band. This idea then went from just a song to an entire album. Also, knowing that they never had to perform the songs live in concert ever again, gave them complete freedom to produce the songs any way they wanted to. Imagine how much different Revolver or Rubber Soul would have sounded if they had stopped touring earlier. This album experimented with vaudeville, classical music, psychedelia, along with pop music. It also experimented with overdubbing, pitch control, automatic double tracking, and other recording tricks that today we all take for granted. They even took their recording tape, spliced it, and flipped it upside down and in the wrong direction just to get new sounds to come out. What came out of all this experimenting was pure genius. Remember, this was all done without the benefit of FL Studio or any other computer program for that matter. None of that had even been invented yet, of course. The album was also the first one to have all of the song lyrics included on every single copy. A practice I really miss these days in the era of digital. Those were good times, just sitting there and reading lyrics to the songs and all the liner notes. Anyway, on June 1st, 1967, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the album, was released in England and on June 2nd in America. The album unofficially kicked off the Summer of Love and turned the Beatles into counterculture symbols. The album is considered to be one of the greatest albums of all time, both in terms of songwriting and technological use, and has been certified with sales of over 11 million copies in America alone and over 32 million copies sold worldwide. Legend has it that when Paul McCartney played an advance copy to Bob Dylan, Dylan responded, "Oh, I get it." What Dylan meant was that the Beatles had grown up. Legend also has it that Jimi Hendrix got a hold of the album on the morning of June 1st, learned the song Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in the afternoon, and played the song that evening in concert with members of the Beatles in the audience, no less. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band had the classic songs Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, With a Little Help from My Friends, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, Getting Better, Fixing a Hole, She's Leaving Home, Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite, Within You, Without You, When I'm 64, Lovely Rita, Good Morning, and A Day in the Life. In 1968, it won 4 Grammy Awards, including Album of the Year. It's no wonder that the Library of Congress put it into the National Recording Registry. The Beatles' iconic album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, released in the UK on June 1st, 1967, and in the US on June 2nd, 1967. 2 years later, another Beatle made a classic while being in bed. John Lennon and Yoko Ono were married on March 20th, 1969. Since they knew that the press were going to hound them during the honeymoon, they decided to use it as a way to promote peace, as the Vietnam War was in full swing at the time, as were the protests against it. They held what they called bed-in performance art protests. The first ones were held in Amsterdam. They had the press come to their hotel room where they would talk about the Vietnam War among many other things, and they did other publicity stunts such as sending acorns in the name of peace to world leaders. After the Amsterdam protests, they decided to do another bed-in. They first tried New York and the Bahamas, but those plans fell through. New York due to John not being allowed in the country at the time, and the Bahamas because it was way too hot at that point. They instead decided to go to Montreal, Canada, so off they went. John wrote a song during the bed-in after giving a reporter an offhanded comment to a question. Then on June 1st, 1969, he and Yoko invited celebrities such as Tommy Smothers of the Smothers Brothers, Petula Clark, Dr. Timothy Leary, Allen Ginsberg, and Dick Gregory. Tommy Smothers helped to play guitar on the song, with everybody else clapping and playing tambourines. Producer Andre Perry, who was called to record the song almost at the last minute by the A&R team at Capitol Records in Canada, set up 4 microphones and recorded the song while John turned the offhanded comment, "Give Peace a Chance," into an anti-war anthem in a hotel bedroom in Montreal on June 1st, 1969. Our last two stories concern the same band. One concerns them directly and one concerns their influence. First, how did an anti-establishment group help to make a now popular billionaire become rich? By turning bad press into big money while creating a classic at the exact same time. In 1977, this group wanted to commemorate the British monarch's Silver Jubilee with a song, a not-so-flattering song. This song was promptly banned by the BBC on May 31st in 1977. Most record stores wouldn't sell the record after that. The song upset so many people that members of the press and Parliament called for the group to be tried for treason. Usually that's the kiss of death for a song and a group, except that this was not just any song, and it certainly wasn't just any group. This was God Save the Queen, and this was the Sex Pistols. The Sex Pistols thrived on pissing off the establishment, so to them, becoming public enemy number one only helped their cause. It also helped that their record label head was a bit of a showman, but a master at marketing. Their record label head was a guy who loved to take risks himself, everything from flying hot air balloons across the Pacific Ocean solo to taking a boat solo across the Atlantic Ocean. The dude was a bit of an adventurer. He took those risks into business, which is what made signing the Sex Pistols seem like a great move to him, as the Pistols had been bounced from EMI Records because of supposed bad behavior. One stunt that this guy pulled was to charter a boat, put huge speakers on it, and blast the song God Save the Queen to maximum while the boat went down the Thames River in London, England. The cops were not exactly thrilled with that and gave chase, which made for priceless marketing footage for the band. In spite of the bans and the boycotts, or maybe because of them, the song quickly became a hit. Stores that did sell the song sometimes sold over 150,000 copies a day. The song never made the number one spot on the singles charts despite its popularity. The best it could ever do was number 2. However, the song made money for the band and especially the head of the record label, Virgin Records head and master of marketing extraordinaire, Sir Richard Branson. And they all have the BBC to partially thank for their good fortune for banning the punk anthem God Save the Queen by the Sex Pistols on May 31st, 1977. Now to the Sex Pistols' influence. Can you imagine being a band who managed to influence 3 musical styles, punk, post-punk, and new wave, all during one concert, all in one night? On June 4th, 1976, the Sex Pistols managed to do just that. They were at that point beginning to just make a name for themselves, but they were not quite big yet. Although their brand was essentially in place, they were still a few months away from becoming what we all know them as today. In 1976, the band was so small that you could go see them in really small clubs, go up to them, and get to talk to them, which is what 2 kids from Manchester, England did one night. Howard Devoto and Pete Shelley went down to London from Manchester to hear them play and were blown away. So much so that they went up to the band and convinced them to play in Manchester a few months later. The band agreed. News of the concert spread by word of mouth, and when the Sex Pistols played Lesser Free Trade Hall in Manchester, England on June 4th, they played to an overwhelmingly huge crowd of less than 50 people. 50. That's it. Not the thousands who say they were there, because they weren't. In a place that holds hundreds of people, less than 50 showed up to hear them play. Yet, much like millions of Americans who claimed that they were at Woodstock when there were only 500,000 people there, virtually every British guy over the age of 50 swears that they were in Manchester that night. Go figure. Something happened that night, though. Something absolutely magical. The Sex Pistols played with such energy and passion that it struck a chord with at least 1/5 of the entire audience. No joke when you add up just how many people they influenced. Stay tuned. They struck a chord so much that those people went and not only started their own bands, they changed music as we know it today. Let's actually start with those two guys who brought the group to play Manchester to begin with, Howard Devoto and Pete Shelley. So that's two. They formed the band The Buzzcocks, which had formed officially in February of that year, but had a few members fall out of the band by the time of this show. They took themselves much more seriously as a band after that performance. Now, here's some other guys. Ian Curtis, Bernard Sumner, and Peter Hook. They formed the group Joy Division. Then when Ian committed suicide, they went on as New Order. So now we're up to 5 guys out of 50. Mark E. Smith started an influential group called The Fall. That's 6 guys. Mick Hucknall ended up in a band called Frantic Elevators before fronting the band that made him really famous and really rich, Simply Red. That's 7 guys. Pat Morley went on to become a famous writer of the music scene of that era. That's 8. Tony Wilson started the record label Factory Records and helped to propel the music of Manchester for almost 2 decades as the epicenter of punk, post-punk, and new wave music. That's 9 guys. Then there's a guy by the name of Stephen Patrick Morrissey, who went on to front the band The Smiths and have a really good solo career while he's at it. So that's 10 guys out of 50 who ended up influencing music just because they heard the Sex Pistols play. As for the Sex Pistols, after that low turnout, they went back to London and played 2 concerts in July of that year. Their opening acts for those concerts were a couple of new bands that no one had heard of yet, The Clash and The Damned, 2 bands that would also go on to change history in their own right. Oh, also, the Sex Pistols did go back to Manchester and played at Lesser Free Trade Hall again only 2 months after their first performance there. This time, hundreds showed up. Punk music had officially taken hold, and the Sex Pistols were on their way. Their opening act for that concert, by the way, Pete and Howard's new band, the Buzzcocks. Don't you love how things come full circle? 1 night, 1 concert, changed lives, changed music, changed the world forever. The Sex Pistols gig at Manchester Lesser Free Trade Hall, the gig that changed the world, as it's commonly known as now, happened on June 4th, 1976. And that is it for the Music History In-Depth podcast for May 29th through June 4th. Thanks for listening.